We're going to talk about designing policies in Rudder, and more specifically how to design policies for long-term usage, because it's easy to set up a demo platform, but it's harder to maintain Rudder configuration in the long term. So I'm Alexis Mousset, I work for Rudder, and I'm a Rudder developer, and Florian can introduce himself.
Yeah, I'm a consultant and I work with Rudder in a few environments, and yeah, sometimes I had to scrap them and I learned a few lessons.
Okay, so we're going to talk about two main topics. One is the policy design itself. How do you organize your rules and directives and all this stuff? And then a more general Rudder usage and how people will interact around Rudder and this kind of topics. So we'll start with some precise things, which is the naming. It's one of the first questions you will have when you start using Rudder. How would you name your techniques, directives, and so on? And in fact, it's really important to have a good insight on what you're doing when you're doing it, because later it will be really harder.
Yeah, you have a lot of work if you want to change them later on, especially if you want to rename them to a certain pattern. So it's easier if you design your whole naming conventions in the start. But even if you do it later, it's worth it. So we had to go through our policy in one place, and I don't know, we had, let's say, around 100 rules, and we had this document describing naming conventions, and then people started looking at them and picking on us, like, but that one is a lowercase install. And then we just fixed it. And the lesson in this thing was, you should have a regex in your documentation so that people, if they're building the name, are able to verify, did I do something that is going to be the naming as expected? If you have that, then it gets put in your subconscious and you can easily identify what the name would be for some object you're looking for. You can search them quickly and even build applications that match on those names, which is what we did.
And another big topic around naming is the searchability of your items, because at some point you'll have hundreds of items in Rudder and you want to be able to find something quickly. So Florian, how would you achieve this?
You need to like imprint what the function is of this thing. So you can't just say file etc resolve.conf. You would probably have to say name resolution file etc resolve.conf, and then you would probably put file in front because that's the object you're managing. And what we also successfully did is to define some kind of scope. So you're not just saying file, you're not just saying resolve.conf, you're not just saying name resolution, but you also say like base OS. And that allows you to find all the settings which are related to the base OS on the one dimension. Then you can find everything to name resolution, and you can find all the file edits. And as you introduce more applications and don't just look at the OS itself, it gets easier if you have the application in there.
Yes, and a good way to do this since Rudder 4.1 is to use tags, because you can have key value tags on rules and directives, and it's a real good use case to use this for these different dimensions of items, properties. Okay, so this is it for the naming, which is kind of the first thing you will encounter. Now we'll talk a bit about how you need to separate data from code. Well, it's not really code, because in Rudder you will generate a lot of things, but we still have some things that behave like code, so which are the techniques actually. And you really want to separate techniques from how you will use them. There's the first security.
Yeah. Basically, your policy should be so clean that you can hand it to somebody for review. They will not run into weird credentials or something. That also allows you to export it, have a backup around, and such things. Now, and I think I should say, if you directly have it in NCF code, for example, it would be shared to all systems, while the variables go through the templating and are per node. So variables are limited to who has to know, and that's what you basically want. We also try to not even have IP addresses in there. That's the part of the infra data. So that if I crack some web server, I will not find out any policy element which is not related to that web server.
So what you can do is use node properties, which are in Rudder what are called node properties are a key value store associated with each node, and then these values can be used anywhere in the policies, and you can use them to store all the data related to the nodes. We have a plugin which is called data sources, which allows synchronizing these properties from an external source, which can be any HTTP endpoint like CMDB or something like this, where you can fetch information and put them automatically into Rudder, which avoids duplicating things and risking being in an inconsistent state. And a really important thing is also that you can have defaults where anywhere you're using a node parameter in the policies, you can specify a default value. So this allows overriding easily with specific things for some nodes without having to modify the policy itself, but only the node properties, basically. And you also have the JavaScript engine in the directive fields. So in the interface, when you're specifying a parameter, for example, a package name or a host name or something, you can use a little JavaScript engine that can run on the content of the field. For example, this will take the first three cars of the host name. So this allows avoiding duplicating things in your data. And the last point, but a really important one, is what we introduced in 4.3 and Nicholas already talked about, which are technique parameters for techniques created with a technique editor. It looks like this, and it's really important because it allows using techniques like code and not like pre-built directives including data, but to cleanly separate code from data.
Yeah, they get reusable completely.
Completely, yeah. So this is really important if you're starting using 4.3, just use this to pass parameters to techniques. It will allow a lot easier maintenance of the whole thing.
Yeah. Can I say something with that example? So honestly, we've been abusing something like that and even risking our reports being compliant because the benefit was so big. Wherever we have like more 3 or 4 packages, we start using iterators, which are just normal CfgMgm iterations, but we pass in JSON and then just have it do the right thing. This will be even more beautiful if you have it like this, because then you can have, let's say the package list is maintained somewhere which is user accessible, and like the end user, the application team, they can just add packages and it happens for them. And so we got our policy unmodified by them because they're just injecting the data.
So now we can talk a bit about node classification. So in Rudder we have groups on which we can apply configuration policies. It's one of the first steps when beginning to configure something with the Rudder is to create groups, because then you need them to be able to apply any configuration. So it's not that difficult, but you need to get groups right, because it's really the basis of your policy. So one first thing is that you can have technical groups for all very technical properties, and business groups that represent the role or the situation of the node.
I don't know what the third point is yet. I'm very interested, but one thing we also learned is if you have, our case, //12/12 sp2, then you really have to check for each policy item that you're attaching to the respective rules. So if it's common for all cases of /, you put it on the highest level, and our /12 sp2 thing contains maybe 2 settings or something, which are really related to that only. That means later if you add more OSs, you can just, but you don't have to copy the whole thing. You just have one more for the next version and do the specifics for that one. Because you, if you span a few years of policy, like a /11 system will have other specifics which are heavily incompatible with the /12 ones. So that's why you need to, like here, you get the Debian 9.2. You should also have one which just says Debian 9 or Debian.
Yes, and this is really easier now because in 4.3 we added the possibility to define a group based on the belonging to another group. So you can say I'll take all the nodes that belong to the Debian group and that have version 9. So it's a very simple case, but this allows building complex groups without redefining the same thing every time. So it allows easier maintenance later if you want to change one of the basis criteria at one of the really base groups. And another thing, which is the lifecycle state, which was introduced in 4.3.2, and that allows having specific states for the nodes. It's different from, completely different from the policy you apply to them. It's how Rudder will behave towards them. So you can, for example, have a node that is in a inventory-only mode. So that means we only keep the inventory of the node, but we won't apply any configuration to it. We won't compute any compliance on this node. And this allows keeping, for example, old nodes or unconnected nodes in the Rudder server without having them breaking basically your compliance.
That means you could manage desktops without getting false alarms when they're off.
Yes. Yes.
Nice.
You can just disable them or or disable compliance computation. So this allows keeping all the nodes even if they change states at some point.
Did I write that?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So as you build directives, meaning small policy objects, you have to make sure that you're, like this case, somebody asked they need X11 support. So we could have put that with their policy, but avoid that. Like detach things from the guy who requested it from you because you want to reuse them. So instead you build a minimalistic X11 directive, and if the guy who requested that needs two more on top of, let's say, the core libraries and the fonts and Xterm or something, then he gets that part. But you want to always not solve, don't solve the problem of the guy who's asking you, solve the problem in a way that it will fit for your whole business, if possible. And do it by taking away parts, otherwise you will also be unhappy. If you start adding packages because now the second guy came along and he needs one more add-on, if you add that to your central policy, you're just making it more complex, so you split. If more than half of the requesters want something, it goes to the main thing, otherwise you split them apart. Or you make combinations. So we have X11 libs and another one which will be for the X11 server, which only is XVNC then, and then we have a third one which actually has hardware drivers and keyboard and stuff. And then we can just say, okay, so they want to install Oracle. Yeah, they need the installer, so they get the first one. They want to install Oracle, but they don't know how to use X11, so they get the one with the VNC. And then you get choices.
Now we're coming to the Technic editor topic, which is a very big one because it's currently the way you configure your policies in Rudder. It's where you make most of the work. Most of the actual work in Rudder will take place in the Technic editor, and it's really important to get things right and not do some simple mistakes. So the first one, it's something we always say about Rudder or configuration management in general, but think in terms of state and not of scripts or actions or steps you want to take. I say it again because the Technic editor may really look like a small script editor, but it's absolutely not that. And you should always keep in mind that even if you have an order of actions, and it will not be executed as a script, and you shouldn't think of it as a script. Always think of all the actions as individual items that will be checked or executed on the node, and not as a list of actions that will be done successfully.
Yeah, I think your example with the repaired condition is really good. So I could do, let's say, I want to ensure a daemon is being started. I could put that in a condition of the package install, like I successfully started the package, now I should start this thing. But that's completely useless. First of all, it's a useless condition because I can just say the thing should be started and it will keep failing until the package is around, and then it will work. And also, I could also say this thing should be running if the configuration is valid and the binary is around. And then I'm completely away from these other changes and ensure I'm only touching the service if needed, but I will always do it.
So you should only use conditions when they are really necessary. Having a check in Rudder is really cheap, so you don't have to think of economy of trying to avoid some checks, or don't think like that. Every generic method is very cheap, so just use them and get compliance, and do not try to be smarter than the agent. So
yeah, I guess the normal ordering for a small NCF method takes probably 2 microseconds or something. We don't need to optimize that.
Yeah.
Something we learned with if you running commands for doing installs or something like that, you can create a large collection of command executions. And I know from the old days where you were told, don't do that, it's expensive. Well, nowadays it's not expensive anymore to run a shell. But it's also expensive in your policy maintenance, because your result classes are really horrible. They have long names, and if you just change one bit of the path, you're gonna forget that you also need to adjust the condition down 5 methods further. And it's also inefficient because you're losing information. So what you should do is to have a very simple stateful wrapper script or state machine-ish, which just has these, it only needs to return these 3 states. So you start with checking, is the application all right? That's your 0. The method, how do I install the application? And an error handler for the upper 2. So it's a shell script of maybe 5 lines. And ideally you would also make an NCF method or something, but even not. Just wrap it, because then you know you have a defined interface up into CfgMgm. And otherwise you're so dependent on the return codes of that application. And these days people write stuff in Python or something and they don't know about return codes, to be honest. Pulp has a command which, if it goes to error, prints the error in red on standard out with a return code of 0. So if you don't have a wrapper for that to detect if something worked or not, you're losing that information and your policy will do not the thing you're expecting. Yeah, okay, that one is easy. So if you, as you're building your directives techniques, you of course follow the flow that you need to do the install. Otherwise, as a human, you cannot design that. But once you're done, you should reorder it to groups, because for the system, you're doing 5 changes to config files, install 8 packages, create 2 directories, and start 1 daemon. You're not doing that in an order. The policy is about what you're changing. And so as for maintainability, if I go back to that technique 2 years later and I need to add 1 more permission, it's much easier if I have a group of permissions in there and just add this one than to think, where should I put that in the order?
And this will allow avoiding thinking as a script, and it will force you to see a state and not a script.
Yeah, we can just
yeah.
that one is self-explaining, is it?
You should try to limit complexity in your techniques. That may seem obvious, but it's really important. If if you want to be able to read them, or if you want someone else to be able to read them. So the first very important point is to absolutely avoid having dependencies between techniques. That would mean you would have to ensure one of the techniques is run before the other, and you absolutely do not want that because it's really hard to do it correctly. So you shouldn't really try to do this. Instead, just pass the same, for example, the same variables to two different techniques. That's cheap, and it's really better than trying to rely on some magical stuff.
So we have one case where we had to do something like it, and we've gone with a class something. So we raise a class if we met a condition where we would need to restart a service, because otherwise we would have been restarting systemd multiple times as we add more policy pieces or change limits. So we're raising one class, and at the end of the execution there is one technique which actually handles based on the result. And the name of this class is defined, so we're not dependent on the single techniques where we're doing that. But it's still not good and not wonderful, and it's racy. So it's just the best thing we could do like that. Generally, for any other case, you shouldn't, and you should stick to that. Yeah, dependencies. That's also the scripting thing again. If you try to use result classes and then you have the second thing dependent on that one, it takes about, let's say, 2 updates to that thing, and you will have broken the dependency chain, and it will never run, which is the good case, or it will run all the time, which is the bad case. And in any case, you will need, or you will waste so much time finding it, because basically you run your agent and nothing is happening. And then you can either be smart and just go into the debug mode of CfgMgm and read like 1 megabyte of text by your hand, and then you find, oh yeah, oh shit, that was me. So the best outcome is that you identify that you were stupid. So and if you don't go into these deep level of dependencies, you won't have the issue. Yeah, and what we also did is we really break apart policies so that we have one which is, for example, a client setup or something, and one which is the configuration of things around it. So we don't try to squeeze everything into one large thing which configures the whole application, because then as you look at it visually in NCF, you get some construct which is like 40 steps or something. And if you would even try to use dependencies in there, you will be scrolling up and down, and you don't have a way to know if you missed one of them. And then you also get like a policy execution where this is going by plan, by plan, by plan. Oh, we didn't do the condition here, so this is running always, and then this all is going to hell. So it's it doesn't work. Yeah, and communications should always be split out, because we know network traffic has state. Basically, we cannot undo there. We're talking to other systems, so anything which is like talking to a system, getting a license or a key back, should be completely separated. Because, yeah.
Definitely. Every time you can rely on an actual check on the system to see if something has to be done or not is way better than using a class from another method. For example, if you have a way to know if a script has run based on what it should have done, it's really better than to check for the repaired class for the script execution or something like this. Because you never know when the agent may be interrupted. We never know if the script has failed or could not be started. It's really important to split up things as much as possible.
Yeah, you might end up and put your state directory in a RAM disk for performance reasons, and if you reboot, you might also end up running different parts of your policy than you thought.
Still in the Technicator,
it is simple. So if you have to scroll for more than 1 or 2 seconds, then it's gotten too big, and The problem isn't, of course, on the technical side. The problem is it's a visual editor, and your brain keeps context. And if you you can go this far, but if you have something down here and then you have to look up here and then you need to edit that, then you will lose track, and then you're lost. And for the iterators, I already said that it's let's say you have to install 100 packages. I can have a 3-step method or a technique, or I could have dozens. So if I can put a list into some data structure, I should just do that.
Okay, so that's all for the technical editor part. Now we're moving to something more specific, but that's really important, and you'll always have to do it in using Rudder or more generic config management, is managing file content in a way or another. So one general advice we can have, the first one would be to clearly identify which files are automatically managed or at least edited to avoid interacting with humans, basically.
Yeah, because the situation where the humans are looking at that file is because we have an error in the policy. It's not doing what the business is needing. Something's broken. So we have to give them the information. Can you edit that one or not? Are we messing around with it or not? And where could you fix it? And that doesn't mean changed by Rudder. You have to tell them where. So we always give them the explicit point where we are originating that policy. It's not automatic, so you have to write it, but it's better than nothing. And this part is the really important one. In whole means this is templated. Don't even try. And otherwise, it wouldn't say that, and then it's probably a file which is done by file edits, because there are some files where you just have to interact with the human and both have the right to do something. But he has to know in which situation he is.
Second one which is to comment the files you distribute. It may be tempting in the first time when you're setting up everything to just drop the configuration you need in your config files and let Rudder do the work and configure them. But you need to keep in mind that people will have to maintain these files, people will have to edit them. So you really need to comment, like you comment your code, you really need to comment your configuration file, even if they are automatically managed by a tool.
Yeah, and you shouldn't, and you end up with the same risk. You could make a comment which is called, this is a bridge, in front of the bridge. So you don't need to take take over the default comments, because people know what the software does, and if not, they can check out the standard .dist file or something, like with Squid or something. I don't need 32,000 lines of comments. I need to know, why is that ACL in front of that other one? So if you put comments in there, use it as an opportunity to document why your policy is doing that thing. Because in 5 years, it's this old setting we needed because something. Can we remove it? I don't know. Can we try? Yes. And then after a week you find out you didn't need it, or damn it, application has been broken, but in a small case where we didn't notice. So that's why you have to document your intent. That's the thing.
A general advice regarding file editions and file content is to use templating or complete file copy as much as possible, and to avoid file editions. File editions are really hard to get right, and you will make mistakes. It's really hard to maintain over time the file content using additions, replacement, deletion of lines. So anywhere you can do it, just use a template or just copy a raw file if you don't have to maintain the content. It will be really, really easier, both to create and to maintain.
And also safer. If the templating doesn't work, you don't get a file, or you keep the old one. If I do file edits, and let's say my system has crashed and I have a 0-byte file there, well, with file edits, I will have a config file with those lines which are driven by the file edits. And if I take my example from a few minutes ago, if I check only if the file is existing and the software is, the binary is available, I will be trying to start that thing, although I just fried the config file. So the templating is much saner.
Last thing is that you will sometimes need to make file additions. So in Rudder you will mainly use the file content technique because file addition generic methods are quite risky to use because they do the additions one at a time. So they will do the first addition, the second one, the third one. So you can really easily end up with a broken file if one step breaks.
Yeah.
Using the file content technique will make the whole computation of the content of the file and then put it, replace the content. So it's safer to use, but it's still really hard. So if you have to use it, try to use sections to limit the place where you will manage automatically the content to allow humans editing other parts, basically.
Yeah, and sections are like the handover point between human and the automation, because if you use sections and you start doing that setting from policy, it will just fetch it. And if the human by mistake edits it again, it will do it again. So the sections are really a wonderful marker, like this is where we mess around. If you do something up there, should be fine, but if you're doing the same thing as we did, we're gonna take it in our side again. Jimmy's, say your sentence. Trust, pass. You said always trust in pass 3 yesterday, the third pass. You don't remember? Okay, he had too much beer. But that's basically the thing. Yes, exactly. Because that's what it does. So this one technique is safe, and you should practice it a bit, because otherwise you could end up like Ansible a few months ago, where they didn't use their file edit for a very long time, and it didn't have tests, and it started editing wrong. And so you even if you try to not use it, be aware of how to use it.
So that's all for file contents. That's something which is related, but a bit different. You want to do as many checks as possible on the policy you're building on the node. There's the file copy with check generic method that will be released soon, and that will allow to copy a file only if a given command returns 0, basically. So this allows to use linters or to use the daemon to validate its own configuration, for example. So this will avoid a lot of issues, specifically with critical policies.
Yeah. I started, especially in setups where you also have to manage applications, to generate, to always document how to test that thing. So each thing gets a YAML file with documentation, which says which service is this stuff running on, which monitoring checks to belong with that, where is the log file, how is it started, and how is the configuration tested. And sometimes I found, I don't know how to test that. And then I just started digging in and making something how to test that. And that gives us the safety to know, like, let me put it like this. If you manage anything on your systems and you don't know how to validate if it's okay or not, then you're not done. That's basically...
You can, since Rudder 4, use audit mode, which means you will just check the state and not do any changes on the system. That's really useful for two main use cases in what we are talking about. It's to integrate old nodes, old pre-existing nodes, and validate that the policy you expect is applied to them is really the actual one. Before taking the risk to break the system. And the other one is for configuration items that were not managed before. For example, if you want to start managing the DNS server from your nodes, you may think they all use the same DNS server currently, but you just want to apply your policy in audit mode first, check that everything is compliant, and then go to enforce mode. Because if one of the machines or one pool of the machines had a different DNS server for some reason, this would break. So just ensure that the state you think the state which is supposed to be is really the actual one before running any changes on the systems. And the last thing is to use runtime conditions. It's a bit of a hack, but it can be useful in some critical cases.
So you basically you want your policy to contain the definition of your systems. We normally won't need to format file systems because we have other tools to do that as the system is being set up. But we also have applications whose configuration is kind of destructive. And I don't want that to ever run again as long as this... No, actually I don't want it to ever run again unless I know it's broken and I want to do it again. But like in any normal condition, it should not be running. And I don't want to, if I do that with repair classes or with like business data from a CMDB or something, I'm always at a slight risk because that is input. So what we do is we set a condition if the server is being installed or this flag is given, that part of the policy is enabled. Otherwise it is not there, and that's just the safest thing I know of. If there is a safer way, you should tell it.
Okay, so this is all for the policy design part. Now we'll talk a bit more about Rudder usage more generally. Well, you should have testing environments.
Yeah, if you don't, like it's a small setup or something, then it's also not deadly. You just have to think, look at how dangerous your change is. You can, if it's a really big problem, you should probably clone the whole rule and attach it to other systems. Like cloning the whole rule means including the directives. Or what you also can do is you just remove the objects you want to modify from that rule, make a second one, and attach only the thing you're going to change, and that goes to a few nodes. So it means if you don't have a testing environment, you could still limit yourself to one system you're running against and just stop executing the full policy for that time. But normally it is horrible if you need to do that, like unlinking policy objects from there and here, and then you forget one of them, or you would have to spend days to write something that clones them automatically. So for that reason, just have a test environment.
And a few last points about cooperation around Rudder. You should use the audit log messages. These are messages you can enter anytime you make a change on the applied configuration on the system. That's really important to document why you change this parameter in the file while you are disabling this service, because probably someone else or even you later will have to know why this change was made, and this is a real good way to document this. You should maintain all your distributed files or templates in a repository. You can use the configuration file git repository in Rudder, but it's really important that you have an history over what you're doing and commit messages indicating why you are changing things. You can use description fields in Rudder. Almost all items have a text description field, which we can use to put documentation references to external documentation system or anything. And yeah, really think of your Rudder configuration and your Rudder configuration history as what your repository is to your code, which means it's the whole history of your infrastructure, and it really has a big value. So take care of this.
I don't have anything to add here.
Okay, so I think that's all. Do you have some questions?
For stamping your config files with like where they come from, or have you considered using like metadata or variables to just render it?
I didn't know which ones could get me there. I would like to. I mean, there's the downside if the policy somehow gets confused that I might not have the info there, but basically I would like it. Yes, we're currently in a little challenge for normal shell scripts. For example, I want to have a pre-commit hook or something that injects the URL to this repository where it's going, and ideally I would like to loop that back and also have the commit ID for that one in there, which of course isn't possible because it's not committed yet. But the same way I would like to have it here. So it wouldn't be much better if this was auto-templated, and it would also work in the cases where we have to do edits. Yeah, it would be much better. But that depends on how good your naming conventions are again, because if I have a good naming convention, I can just basically write rule name / directive / maybe bundle name in there or something. And if I have a messy convention, then it will not be really good. But I would like that. We also
I guess I was thinking more about like pulling it out of the running state.
Oh. I'm not sure, because I just noticed that at some points I lose the running state because something is broken or whatever. So that would be the downside. But you would have to show me. Probably anything is better than what we do manually, like because people can forget, or they don't get the header completely right. There's a small thing which is wrong in there, and then I go, you need to change that, and then I'm writing emails and escalating, and then we're escalating text files. So yeah, technical solution would be better for this non-technical problem. Anything else?
I think
okay.
What you said makes a lot of sense, even if it's not Rudder. I mean, a lot of things that you said make sense even if you're using CfgMgm.
Well, sorry.
Not sorry, it's actually a good thing.
Yeah.
I'm saying it as a good thing, not as
okay. Yeah.
like it
just making
it's
fun.
Actually, some of that type of wisdom that when you see it is, well, of course it's right, but you would never think about that before you hit your face on the wall for it.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's like once you. If you go to a system you already set up, and is it automatically configuring that bit? And then you have to search in your policy, and it's what they called in the Google book the drag. Like it makes you crazy if you have to dig around in configurations. Like for me, I had started with a lab environment when I was testing Rudder, then I was happy and I started blowing up that lab environment, and I knew I should not use my lab server. I should have a second one. Of course I didn't, because it was working and it was cool. And then I made the new server so that I don't have to work with the lab server. And yeah, but I didn't put the policies over there. And then there was this customer project. Then I had another Rudder server, and I ended up feeling so, yeah, cobbler setup. So which one has the current templates? And yeah, I had this thing for Apache, but it's not here. And which server? I got to the point where it was like, which server does my cron shell has my cron shell config? And that one I had shut down. So yeah, on the new one I don't have it. And I had this lucky opportunity that in one environment I have to work really professionally, and then so I split up like in personality. So there's this one guy who has this mess with 5 servers or something, and he's learning from the other part of me who needs to stick to quality rules and establish standards to avoid that shit. And if they ever meet again, it will be good.
Okay, so thank you.